Hello and a warm welcome to this brand new Sustainability Education podcast. I'm Dr. Stefan Siegel, postdoc researcher at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. In sustainability education, ideas and assumptions exist that sound plausible, but that are at least questionable or even dangerous at a closer look. In this podcast, I want to discuss myths and facts about sustainability education and the things in between. For this purpose, I invite world-leading experts on environmental and sustainability education, educational psychology, and myth and misinformation research. This podcast series is part of the research project Identifying, Understanding, and Challenging Myths in and about Sustainability Education. My vision is a more evidence-informed, effective, and ethically responsible sustainability education, and I hope to push the boundaries of knowledge in this field. I would be most delighted if you listened in and joined our conversation. You can do so on all the usual podcast platforms. Enjoy listening. Dr. John Cook is a senior research fellow at the Melbourne Centre for Behaviour Change at the University of Melbourne in Victoria. He holds a PhD from the University of Western Australia, where he studied the cognitive psychology of climate science denial, and in the past he also worked in web programming and graphic design. John's current focus in research is understanding and countering misinformation related to scientific issues such as climate change and/or vaccination. He has authored and co-authored numerous publications in high-ranking journals and has received several awards and prizes for his contributions, among others to science communication. In 2007, John founded Skeptical Science, a website for advancing climate change knowledge. He has also created the Cranky Uncle Game, which uses cartoons and gamification to enhance critical thinking and resilience against misinformation. He currently works with organizations like Facebook, NASA, and UNICEF to develop evidence-based responses to misinformation. And as misinformation poses a big threat to democracy, I'm very happy to speak with John today about how to counter misinformation, what it actually is, about climate change, but also sustainability education. Welcome, John. Where are you joining us from today?
Hi, Stefan. Great to talk to you. I'm in Melbourne, based at the University of Melbourne, and it's winter here, so it's very cold.
Well, thanks for being here. Let's start right away with the first thematic area. It's about understanding sustainability education and educational myths. On your website, Skeptical Science, you use different terms such as misinformation, myths, misconceptions, or skeptic arguments about climate science. Could you clarify if and how you would differentiate between these terms?
Sure. And there is a lot of terminology used, and it can get a bit jargony, and you can actually get sunk deep into a rabbit hole if you try to fine tune these definitions. Misinformation generally is false information, regardless of the intent. In other words, people might genuinely believe the misinformation, or they might be trying to intentionally deceive you. But misinformation is just that it's false, not what people intend. Whereas disinformation is when people know that it's wrong, but they're intentionally trying to deceive you. And so those are two important distinctions. The other term that comes up a lot in this area is climate skeptic, and people who dismiss the science on climate change like to call themselves climate skeptics. But I find, and others find, that this is a problematic term because skepticism, genuine scientific skepticism, is a good thing. A skeptical approach looks at the evidence first and then comes to a conclusion. Whereas people who are dismissive or denying climate science, they start with their conclusion, their beliefs, and then they reject any science that disagrees with those conclusions. And that's the opposite of skepticism. So people who are dismissive, calling themselves climate skeptics, is problematic. I tend to use terms like dismissiveness, like dismissive, which is used in the scientific literature, but it's a good description of what they do. Also, they're denying the science, or they're contrarian. Again, lots of jargon.
Would you differentiate, for instance, between myths or misinformation, or is kind of misinformation the broader term and then myth a subcategory or something like
Myth is a singular term. So like if you're referring to a specific misinformation argument, I would call that a myth. So it's a single example of false information. And misconceptions are people's beliefs while misinformation are arguments or content. So it's good also to conceptually distinguish between what people believe and the arguments that people make. Often they're the same thing. I believe this, so I'm going to make this argument. But conceptually, they are two different things. But ironically, I'm writing a chapter right now where I look at all the different studies that try to organize climate misinformation. And sometimes they look at the arguments being made, and other times they look at the different beliefs that people have. And both approaches, you get the same thing. You get the same patterns, structures.
Oh, that's super interesting and super helpful. You've worked a lot on climate science myths. Educational myths and sustainability education could currently be considered hot topics of very relevant fields. What comes to mind when you hear the terms myths in and about sustainability education?
So there is a bit of an overlap between climate change as a topic and sustainability, but sustainability is, I guess, a more narrow topic, whereas climate change is much broader and looking at climate science and whatnot. I would say that what comes to my mind is that climate change myths can often be a lot more black and white or more easily fact-checkable, because you're talking about areas of science that have been settled for 10, 20, 100, 200 years, very rock-solid science where there's a strong consensus and it's been replicated by many studies. So we know it with strong confidence. And then when you have arguments that contradict consensus science, it's a lot easier to fact-check and say, no, that's misinformation. Then when you get into topics like policy, conspiracy theories, ad hominem attacks against scientists, these are the areas of climate science where it's just a little bit more challenging to do standard fact-checking and you have to look at other approaches. And I would liken sustainability misinformation in a similar area. Often it is about, murkier is not quite the right word, but just less settled science type topics and therefore more challenging to fact check.
Do you see a connection between climate science denial, climate change education and sustainability education? If so, how are they connected? You already alluded to that.
Well, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is what drives climate science denial. And the biggest driver is not to do with education levels or income levels or age or gender or any of those basic demographics. The biggest driver of why people deny climate science is because of their political beliefs and their political affiliation. Basically, when people don't like the solutions to climate change, such as regulating the fossil fuel industry, if they don't like government regulation, then rather than come up with a different solution, they just deny that there's a problem in the first place. So I would say that if there is a connection between climate science denial and climate education and sustainability education, possibly a thread that runs through those is that the opposition or the misinformation across all those topics are probably coming from the same place. Yeah, the technical term, just to get jargony again, is solutions aversion. People don't like the solutions, so they deny that there's a problem in the first place. But actually, there's more recent work that shows that it's not just about our beliefs about government regulation. It goes deeper than that now. The issue has become so polarized, climate change, that people are now getting tribal about it. The issue has become tribal, and now it's about us and them. And so I think that you would probably have an element of tribality across climate change and sustainability issues as well. So people who oppose or promote misinformation about sustainability probably are leaning conservative, and they would see sustainability arguments as coming from the left, and you're coming from people who are also promoting other things that I don't like. Not me, John Cook, don't like, but people who are denying climate change.
I see. I find it very enlightening, the solution aversion, and I think I also get the tribalization when I look, for instance, at the political situation in Germany or the US. Let's go a step further. Your and your team's work on skeptical science has led to an really extensive database of nearly 200 climate science myths and their refutations. When you think of your decades of experience in research and practice, have you also come across myths about environmental and sustainability education? If you differentiate between climate science myths and sustainability education myths?
To be honest, not really. I've had my hands full enough with climate misinformation, so I'm sure there's plenty out there. But there's misinformation across all topics, I'm
Yeah.
finding, and so you have to pick a lane. In fact, even just on climate change within that topic, the topic of climate communication, there are so many ways that you can come at that, and there's so many different ways to communicate the reality of climate change and try to promote climate action. And I made the strategic decision long ago to just narrowly focus on just the misinformation slice of the pie, figuring that rather than spread myself too thin, it was better to try to really tackle a single issue thoroughly as possible. And so, that meant that having to really exclude other misinformation in other areas, which is a shame. I wish there were more hours in the day, but
for me, these myths are about teaching and learning regarding sustainability. And one example, in my opinion, would be, for instance, that sustainability education is only about teaching persons about environmental issues, like about the ecology, maybe also about only content. Another would be to make students eco-warriors, or that sustainability educators are ideologists who are indoctrinating students. So that would be kind of, for me, sustainability education myths.
And you can see that element of tribality in those later arguments too. It's bleeding across topics.
Now, if you think back to the beginning of your own career, what misconceptions, myths, or questionable beliefs did you yourself have about educating others about climate science myths or sustainability education?
So just to get a bit meta then, like rather than talk about the actual climate myths, but the myths about the education and tackling the issue of misinformation. One myth that I tackled was, and this has been throughout, like from early on, was we should ignore misinformation. It wasn't solutions aversion, it was misinformation aversion, or probably more accurately, controversy aversion. I think that in the natural science community, like climate scientists and all scientists and academics, we're quite comfortable in our ivory towers and it can get quite nasty out on the street. And so I think that a lot of scientists kind of understandably are reluctant to engage with the issue of misinformation because it can get a bit unpleasant when you push back against misinformation. If you push back in a way that is impactful, if you're trying to communicate and it's making a difference, then you will get pushed back against your own efforts. And that can be challenging. It's certainly been challenging for me. I've seen a reluctance to engage with controversy amongst academics. And that's dangerous because if we leave misinformation unchallenged, then it will continue to grow and negatively impact people.
Yeah, I think you have a current paper with Ecker about misinformation being a threat to democracy.
Yes, and the reason why we wrote that paper and other papers, like we have a couple that have just come out or in the process of coming out, it was really in response to academics who minimize misinformation. Or the problem of misinformation, either arguing, it's not a problem, we shouldn't respond to it, or
we can do it later.
Or the response you're doing is worse than the problem. And it's really interesting that minimizing the problem of misinformation uses all the same types of arguments and logical fallacies as minimizing the problem of climate change.
That's super, super interesting because I think there's a similar myth about sustainability educators where sometimes they self have the perception that they have to stay neutral, or others tell them, hey, stay neutral, don't ideologize or indoctrinate our children or students. And sometimes probably it's easy for academics to stay in the ivory tower and don't get their hands dirty, so to speak, with those with this political stuff.
There's one thing I've been pitching to educators as well in response to that sentiment, which is there is research into the teaching approach, which has several names. It's called misconception-based learning, refutational teaching, agnotology-based learning. All these different names refer to the approach of teach the science or teach the facts, by addressing misinformation that tries to undermine the facts. And what the research finds is if you teach the facts in this way, by addressing misinformation, challenging the facts, you actually get greater learning effects. It's actually even more effective than just teaching the facts straight. And it sticks. It lasts longer than just teaching the facts.
That's really comforting to hear. I do that more and more in my educational psychology lecture because I find it more sustainable if you only teach the facts, so to speak, but also show how it was produced and what there might be misconceptions or preconcept. I find it quite valuable. And sometimes this is also a nice hook to catch students' attentions to play with their everyday theories about things.
Yeah, there's a number of benefits. It has a hook, like you said, it grabs their interest more. And it also teaches them critical thinking as well as the facts. Yeah. And it helps them resolve that conflict between facts and misinformation. So it's a very powerful way to teach. So I try to promote the concept to educators that misinformation isn't a necessary evil that we have to confront. Rather, it's actually an educational opportunity. It's a way to teach our facts in a more engaging and sticky way.
Yeah. So to speak, a catalyst for learning or a good learning opportunity. When it comes to the origins of misinformation or myths, in an article with Ecker again and colleagues, you wrote that there are very strong socio-affective and cognitive drivers. To what extent do you think that these drivers also apply to myths in and about sustainability education or to educational myths in general? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'll answer this cautiously because it's not something I've studied in depth. But the sense I get, and just from the little experience I have had with this, is inertia. People like to do things the way they've always done it, so you can be pushing up against that. Secondly, there is that aversion to controversy, and I think that that's a big driver within education and tackling misinformation, and also within the science community and academic community generally. And it depends on what part of the world you're living in. If you're in a quite polarized or conservative region, then I've heard of concern from educators that they're going to get pushback from parents if they're teaching their students about sustainability or climate change. Yeah, I think that caution is one of the drivers to, I guess, the myth that we shouldn't confront misinformation. And then I think probably there are the general drivers like political ideology and affiliation would be in the mix as well. And then there is the other probably the biggest elephant in the room for educators, lack of resources. Like they just, they have trouble fitting everything into their semester that they can. And so when they hear people like me saying, hey, we should do misconception-based learning, they're like, we can barely fit it in as it is. So that's why I think it's important for educators to get a lot of support and resources to help them do this type of education.
I would absolutely agree to the point. When you think of the consequences of potential myths in and about sustainability educations on educators, students, and the broader society, when it comes to climate science, myths is kind of it is clearer, let's say that. But when it comes to these myths about sustainability education, what could be impacts of that? If teachers or students operate on questionable beliefs.
Over time, I've become increasingly convinced that because my discipline, like my PhD, was around climate communication, and climate communication tends to be about public engagement and coming up with messaging to engage the general public. But over time, I've become more convinced that the way to make deep, lasting impact on these issues like climate change and sustainability is through education, is through the classroom. And for example, with our Cranky Uncle Game, we ended up promoting it to educators rather than to the general public. And that was the way that we distributed it.
So a multiplier approach.
Yeah, the educators are the multiplier. And I really learnt that principle from my time at the Center for Climate Change Communication, which is George Mason University in the US, run by Ed Maybach. And his mantra was simple, clear messages repeated often through a variety of trusted messengers. And the messengers was really important. And so they identified important messages like TV weathercasters or health professionals.
I see.
And for me, it was educators. in terms of trying to build public resilience against misinformation. And so it's been about promoting education. And so that means that education is a big opportunity or a tool, a way, a method for educating the public and raising awareness of climate change and sustainability issues. But it also means that if there are myths about sustainability education that is preventing educators from taking on these approaches, we're missing out on this opportunity. We're not fulfilling the potential of education to have a societal impact.
Yeah. Sometimes you hear the statement that education will save the world or save the planet. I think the planet will be fine with us or without humans, but will save humanity because education is such a powerful weapon. And you often look at education as part of the solution. For instance, David Orr, a distinguished professor of environmental studies from the US, says or also points to the negative aspects of education, that he says the destruction of our planet is not, or our societies is not the work of ignorant people. Rather, it's the one of people with PhDs, MAs, BAs, etc. So he also points to the fact that education can be also part of the problem. What would be your stance on that?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a bit of a twisted way of looking at it, isn't it? Because if education is part of the problem, that doesn't mean that ignorance is part of the solution. It's not the education that's causing the problem. It's other things, and the actors who are creating the problem, whether it's a fossil fuel executive or a politician who is promoting environmentally damaging policies. It's not because they got educated that they're doing it. They're doing it for other reasons, but the education gives them the tools to be able to do it. But the only way to stop them is through educated people doing evidence-based approaches. So I'm really reluctant to paraphrase the NRA, but the only thing that can stop a bad guy with education is a good guy with education, maybe.
Yeah. Let's get on to another thematic area. A key goal of my habilitation is to develop sustainability education mythology or myth navigator, kind of similar to the database which you did for skeptical science, with all those arguments put forth by those who oppose the mainstream scientific consensus on climate change. And currently working on that, so to speak. I would love to create a web or a wiki of myths in and about sustainability education and the refutations. And also with view or to your years of experience and research and practice, what do you think, which myths could or should be included?
Yeah, it's a good question. The general approach we took with skeptical science was we were tracking different misinformation articles and what arguments were being used in them, and then basically building a tally of which were the most common myths. And so that was how we built our leaderboard. We had a top 10 list. I think we still have that on the homepage. And so, yeah, we did try to prioritize which myths based on how often they were coming. Since we did that, way back in, the 2000s, we've done a lot of research to answer that question in a much more systematic, methodical way. So we've developed machine learning models to put in hundreds of thousands of articles and then detect all the different arguments and work out which arguments are the most common. And so that's given us a much more comprehensive look at which misinformation is more prevalent. And right now we're in the process of testing all those different arguments in psychology experiments to see which are the most damaging, which have the most impact on reducing people's climate perceptions and their belief that we can stop climate change. So efficacy is the jargon we would use. And I'll just give you a quick top line summary of what we're finding, because both ways of looking at it, the prevalence of arguments and how damaging the arguments are, both find the same result. The most damaging and prevalent arguments are attacking climate solutions and attacking scientists, or ad hominem attack. So ironically, skeptical science has been focused on the science arguments, the argument saying that global warming isn't happening or not caused by humans or the impacts won't be bad. But we're finding those aren't the most prevalent arguments. It's more the policy and solutions arguments and actually just attacking the science and scientists. And so in a way, we're not addressing the most prevalent arguments at the beginning of skeptical science. And we really need to transition to what actually are the most damaging misinformation arguments.
Oh, I guess that's a big learning. For me, very insightful, because I'm thinking if it's maybe similar to attacking solutions in education, teaching and learning, and also attacking like sustainability educators, that they are Birkenstocks wearing liberals who want to indoctrinate children. But I think like tackling the science misinformation or the science myth might be easier a little bit.
Oh, it is. It's definitely the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason why skeptical science, guilty as charged. But, most people working in the climate misinformation world, we've tended to firstly research those arguments and write papers about the science arguments, and also develop debunkings and respond to them. It's the shallow end of the pool. That's where we've been playing. But at the deeper end, the harder myths are the policy myths and the attacks.
Yeah. But I think this shouldn't diminish the value of the work you've done, because I think it gives the educators or the multipliers, so to speak, valuable resources at the hand, which they can easily use when arguing. Or often evidence is not that helpful when it comes to changing people's beliefs. I think Gail Sinatra has done a lot of research on conceptual change and the hat trick of change that is needed. But it's nonetheless essential if we want to have informed discussions, right?
Yeah. We don't want to throw facts out altogether. We still want to communicate. Yeah. So I'm not trying to minimize facts at all.
Do you think that there may be foundation myths or super claims that other misconceptions in sustainability education build upon?
Well, I'll tell you what we've done, and it sounds like you're already seeing parallels to sustainability education already. So we saw 5 super claims in climate misinformation. It's not real, as in global warming is not real. It's not us. It's not bad. These are the 3 science arguments. We can't solve it. These are the policy arguments. And you can't trust the experts.
Okay.
So these are attacking the science. So first 3 are science. The first 3 super claims are science-based. The 4th is solutions-based. And the 5th is attacking.
Yeah. It reminds me also a little bit of the delay strategies of climate actions. It's not us.
And so after we published our paper in 2021, where we trained a machine learning model to detect misinformation, and we developed this taxonomy with the 5 super claims. Afterwards, and also before, there's been lots of other studies that have looked at different aspects of climate misinformation, whether it's Stefan Rahmstorff from Potsdam looking at the first 3, it's not us, not real, not bad. But there's been a lot of studies on the 4th category of policy and solutions misinformation, including one of the most prominent studies was done actually coming from Germany again, William Lamb, who I was in Berlin last week and visited their center. So
nice.
It was great to meet him in person. And so they published a paper on the discourses of delay, delayism, which is really goes in even more in depth into those policy misinformation.
I see. You already alluded to it. If you were to approach creating such a mythology, what criteria or categories would you use to organize it? What were your ideas when you structured your database?
Well, the first thing I would suggest as a general approach to creating this kind of website was, when I set up Skeptical Science, I envisaged there were 2, this is a bit simplistic, but there were 2 models of creating a website like this: the hamster wheel model or the pyramid model. The hamster wheel model is where you're just blogging and you're basically throwing content down a bottomless pit, and you can just keep posting article after article, and it, you can do that for years, and then you look back and think, well, what have I created? Like what's there? What have I got to show for it? But the alternative approach is to have a structure in mind, and every time you add new content, you're building this structure, this pyramid. And so that was the approach I took with Skeptical Science, where I had this organized structure of misinformation, and I wanted to create an encyclopedic resource so that whenever people Googled, is the sun causing global warming, or did global warming stop in 1998, or other climate myths, I wanted a specific page directly addressing that to come up in the search results. So it was about creating this evergreen standing resource. So that's the general approach I would recommend, that you don't look to create just a series of blog posts, but have a structure that's organized, with each page being a discrete debunking of a myth, with the goal of when people Google that myth, you want that page to come up.
So it's kind of a rather deductive approach, or an architect approach, rather than being kind of a gardener where you just create stuff and then link it afterwards, and where the structure emerges later on. If I got that correctly.
Yes, I would. That's a good way of paraphrasing what I just said, in a more intelligent way.
And what I really like about what you did, like the addressability of every myth or every page, so that you could also share a link very easily with others, and it leads directly to the resource.
As in the short URLs.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think it was the Conservation Foundation or some environmental website. They were doing these short URLs where it was something like tcf.to/ some short word. And I was like, what's .to? And I looked it up, and it was the subdomain the domain for Tonga, the Pacific island. And you can register a domain with a Tongan domain registrar. So I just registered SKS for skeptical science.to, and then I was able to just set it up so that I could just create a short URL for each myth, and it makes it very easy to remember and share with people. And
also on social media,
a very convenient way of distributing the links.
Absolutely. What were your ideas to structure the database? Was it kind of prevalence of the myths, the chronological order, thematically based? Is there any criteria which you can apply?
Kind of all of those, because we have in our menu, we have a link, a navigation link, and you drop down and it can list them by prevalence or by thematic or by taxonomy. So we have done them in all the different ways. But really, the main way is by taxonomy or theme. Okay. So it's taking those overarching super claims, and then you can drill down to subcategories and even subcategories.
I think that makes sense, as Gail Sinatra and Jacobson say that myths often appear in herds, that they come in clusters, so to speak. So I think this thematic classification is kind of very useful.
One thing we noticed with our machine learning research was that idea of clusters, because we initially trained our machine learning model where we just would start with an example of text and map it to a single claim. And eventually we realized, and we had to make some simplification decisions at the beginning just to get the research done. It's always the first step. But then after we'd finished that research, we realized really you do see multiple claims in single arguments. Even a single sentence can contain 2 or 3 claims, misinformation claims. So we're in the process now of retraining our model so that our training data set does multiple claims. So an example of climate misinformation that comes in clusters is the argument that global warming has been on hiatus for the last 10 years. Therefore, the climate models can't be trusted because they predicted warming and we're not seeing warming. Therefore, the models are wrong. And the challenge there is you're saying that different themes come in clusters. These are actually 2 arguments from completely different ends of the taxonomy. So you've got on category 1, global warming is not happening, and category 5, you can't trust climate models. So this is an interesting challenge, is that you can have arguments that come together, but they can be from completely different parts of the taxonomy.
I find it also astonishing, maybe in discourses or in debates, maybe this also is not intended strategy of people that are putting forward these myths. It's kind of a myth hopping, which makes it really difficult to then debunk or engage, because you have to think in very different directions and use very different fallacies or counter arguments to explain or to counter what is being said.
Yeah, and countering is the challenge when they're making multiple arguments like that. And that's something we've just begun to experimentally test with what do you do when an argument has multiple fallacies. We don't have a definitive answer to that yet.
Yeah. Have you dealt with claims that were or are difficult to even falsify? So kind of normative, vague, future-oriented, policy-oriented claims. And what did you do with those? Did you exclude them from skeptical science, or are those claims also on there? And could you really say, hey, this is a myth? Or do you have also kind of nuanced category, or there is not that much research on this topic? We can't say whether it's a myth or a fact.
Yeah, that's a really good question that I've been thinking about a lot. Just even over the last few weeks, I've been working on that exact question. There are two approaches to analyzing misinformation or trying to identify misinformation. The two approaches are fact-based or logic-based. So fact-based is fact-checking to see whether it's factually false claim or not. But often there are categories of misinformation or potential misinformation that are difficult. As you say, normative claims that can be to do with values, societal values, or what's more important to us, rather than just physics or the climate science. You also can have, as you say, vague arguments or arguments that have unstated assumptions or hidden premises. And you can have future predictions, and it's hard to fact check a prediction of the future because it hasn't happened yet. And lastly, one of the most challenging forms of climate misinformation, the use of true statements to cast a misleading impression. Cherry picking is an example of this. Just focusing on a small piece of data and ignoring the larger picture. So, for example, saying, here is a glacier in New Zealand that's growing, and using that to cast doubt on the reality of warming by looking at just one glacier that's growing and ignoring that globally, the vast majority of glaciers are shrinking. So all of these types of misinformation are difficult to tackle using the fact-based approach. And therefore, I've been looking more and more at the logic-based approach, which is basically looking for the presence of logical fallacies or misleading rhetorical techniques in the argument. And what you end up with then is, if you do find fallacies, then you can label that claim as misleading. So it's a different category. It's not true false like with fact checking. It's either misleading or not misleading. And the logic-based approach is quite versatile because you can use it for basically all types of misinformation. With those 5 super claims I was talking about, you can use fact-based on the first 3 categories, the science arguments, but it's harder with the 4 and 5, the policy arguments and the attacks. But the logic-based approach works across all of these categories, and I wouldn't say that it should be used instead of fact-based, but it complements the fact-based approach.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to sustainability education, I think this logic-based approach could be very helpful, in contrary to the fact-based approach, because sometimes there aren't facts on whether direct instruction or exploratory learning is better. There are studies in favor of the one or the other. I tend more to lean in on the direct instruction is more useful, but it also depends on the goal or what you want to achieve as a lecturer. So there might be meta-analysis, there might be reviews, etc. But sometimes it's not clear what is fact and what is myth, so to speak. But you can point maybe to logical fallacies, for instance, when you think about future skills as the solution to our grand challenges that we face. Kirschner and colleagues wrote quite nicely, those future skills, like the 21st century skills, are not very 21st century because those skills have been around for a long time, and sometimes they're competences or even dispositions of people. So they were useful already in the past, and what will happen in 2200? And also, they're not skills. So you could point to, hey, it's a questionable or misleading terminology. Of course, they nevertheless might be helpful to address our problems that we have.
Yeah, it's not like we invented critical thinking. We're
Right,
we're using ideas that Aristotle was talking about. So,
right.
and in fact, it's been a recurring theme in my academic career that
Mhm.
I think I come up with an idea and then learn that someone already came up with it 200 years ago and or 50 years ago. And so, yeah, it's that doesn't mean that those ideas are outdated. I
Mm.
think that critical thinking is a pretty universal and eternal skill that all generations need.
And a professor from Germany, Marco Kaitz, he wrote recently an article about these 21st century skills. And in the discussion, he pointed to a thing which struck me quite a lot, that these bandwagons or these pseudo inventions, that they sometimes can hinder progress. So we first have to learn these new skills. We first have to adapt that new framework, kind of a form of sophisticated procrastination. That was for me very insightful. But maybe that's another discussion. What is your strategy when it comes to writing refutations? Do you create the elementary version first or the more advanced, elaborate version? And or is it a mix?
Yeah, well, firstly, I start with the structure. I mentioned fact-based and logic-based.
Hmm.
When you're writing a debunking, you want both.
Yep.
So I try to write my debunking to the structure fact, myth, fallacy,
Mm.
fact. So the first thing I do is identify what is the key fact that dislodges the misinformation or falsifies the misinformation.
Hmm.
And my debunking leads with that. And I try to communicate it in a simple, sticky way so that it's not too hard for the reader or the audience. Then I summarize the misinformation and then I explain the fallacy that the misinformation uses to distort the facts. So what you're doing there is you're presenting people the conflicting pieces of information, fact and myth, and then you're helping them resolve that conflict by explaining the fallacy. And this is another example where I learned that German philosophers came up with that concept of fact myth fallacy back in the 1800s. They called it hypothesis, antithesis, synthesis,
Synthesis. Yeah.
because the fallacy is helping synthesize these conflicting arguments. And then I finish with the fact again. So you want to,
Yeah.
what we call a truth sandwich. We want to emphasize the facts. We don't want to put too much emphasis on the myth because we don't want that to be what people remember coming away. We want them to remember the sticky fact that we're trying to communicate.
Yeah.
So that's a general structure or template that I'm trying to do. As for whether we start with the simple version or the advanced version, it can happen either way. I don't think there is any fixed method. Some people, because we have multiple authors writing rebuttals of critical science, some would start simple and build it up, and others might start long and complex and then try to boil it down. I tend to start in the middle, actually. Like skeptical science began as the intermediate rebuttals, and then as a team started to build around it, they took the intermediate rebuttals and created simple ones, and other people created longer ones.
No. And I think regarding length, you now have also like these brief facts, which I find very useful. So there are very boiled down versions of the refutations, right?
As in the little green boxes
Yeah.
at the top of the rebuttal. Yeah, that began because the first version of skeptical science was like it had the myth at the top and then just a long debunking. And somebody emailed me and said, the debunkings are great, but could you put a short summary at the top so I didn't have to read the whole thing?
Yeah.
And I emailed back quite crankily saying, no, I went to all the trouble to write it, so you can go to the trouble to read it. But the more I thought about his suggestion, the more I realized that there was a lot of value in that, and
makes sense. Yeah.
not everyone is going to read along debunking. So I went to at the time, I think there was only about 50 odd rebuttals or less. So I went through each of them and wrote a paragraph summary. And after I published that and added all of those to the web page, then somebody emailed me and said, I really like how you have that paragraph summary, but could you also write a single sentence summary? At that point, I threw a tantrum and said, no, I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
And then I said, if you want to have a crack at that, be my guest, go for it. And a few weeks later, he sent me a Word document where he took every myth and
Nice.
he had a single sentence debunking. And I read through because I didn't think it was possible. I thought it's hard
Yeah.
enough doing a paragraph summary, like boiling
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
this complicated science to a paragraph. You're not going to do a single line. And I read through all his single line rebuttals and thought, he's actually done it. Wow, I'm
Nice.
surprised. So
Sounds really
it's
good. And this was the time before AI, like generative AI, etc.
well, long before. That's only been the last year or so. Yes, yeah, humans had to do it. We had to think for ourselves back then.
When are you happy with a refutation? What is your definition of done? When do you
Yeah, that's
say
like,
this refutation
I
is fine,
mean,
it can go on the website or in an article or something like that?
the this is the way that historically the way we approached that
Mm.
was, as I said, I initially started by writing all these intermediate rebuttals. And another person sent me an email with a suggestion. A lot of people have suggestions on how I can do skeptical science better.
Yeah.
Rarely offering to help, but they just are very helpful in suggesting things that give me more work. One person emailed me a article by Real Climate, the climate blog run by Gavin Schmidt. And Gavin was suggesting that science communicators and educators should explore communicating their science at different levels. And he used the metaphor of ski slopes, where you have the green slopes for basic skiers, the blue slopes for intermediate, and then the black slopes for advanced skiers. And he says we should do the same with our science communication. And so the person who was emailing me, I'm just blanking on his name, but he was a physicist from Sydney. He suggested you should do the same thing with skeptical science and write 3 types of rebuttals for, 3 levels for each of your rebuttals.
Super cool,
And
but a lot of work.
yeah, it was an insane amount of work. So I emailed him back saying, "You want to help?" And he said, "No, no, I just didn't get this idea." And again, I was like, "Well, I'm not going to do that. That's too much work." But again, I recognized the how good an idea it was. So I basically posted a blog post on the website saying, here's this idea that Gavin Schmidt has suggested, 3 levels of rebuttals. Who wants to help me do that? And basically I was saying, I have intermediate rebuttals. I have lots of blue slope rebuttals.
Mm-hmm.
Who thinks that they can take my existing rebuttals and create a green slope basic version? And up to that point, I'd spent several years trying to get people to help me do skeptical science with no success. Basically, when I said to people, you want to help me debunk climate myths, that was just too difficult and intimidating a task to take on. But when I asked people for a much more achievable task, which was take my existing content and simplify it,
okay,
overnight, I had dozens of people saying, yeah, I think I can do that. Exactly. It was a much more achievable task. And Ed Maybach has another one of his mantras, which is if you want to get behavior change, you need to make it easy, fun, and impactful. I think those are the 3. I don't know how fun it was, but it was definitely easier and impactful. And I think that the combination of those 2 things was the reason why so many people offered to help. And so suddenly I had dozens of people all simultaneously writing debunkings or basic versions of the existing debunkings. And then we had to challenge, how do we process this? How do we manage all this? And I was I was like that old Wallace and Gromit video where he's laying the train tracks down in front of the train. I was trying to keep the infrastructure, build infrastructure for all these people writing content, because I was really conscious of this huge momentum that suddenly built, and I didn't want the momentum to dissipate. And so the approach we took to quality control our rebuttals, and I'm coming to the answer of your question now, was we created our own internal peer review system.
Oh, nice.
Where we created an internal forum and people could post their rebuttals, and then all the other authors would either post comments saying, fix this, change that, that's wrong, that's right, or whatever. Or if they thought that it was ready to go, they would post a green thumb. And as a general rule of thumb, pardon the pun, we found that when a rebuttal got about 5 green thumbs, it was ready to be published. So to answer your question, we used an internal peer review system to get our rebuttals up to sufficient quality.
And did you use kind of a refutation rubric? I saw in the MOOC that you did on climate science denial that you had like this rubric that refutation has to be sticky, that it has to be factually correct, and that it follows this truth sandwich or this structure of debunking.
Unfortunately, the rubric only came several years later.
I see.
Like we actually put it together in 2015 when we launched the MOOC, whereas this was happening, I think, around 2011. So, and also I started my PhD in 2011. So I was really only finding out a lot of the psychology of misinformation and best practices doing that research in later years. So it's another example of laying the tracks down before the train. Like we're still figuring out how to debunk more effectively while we're still doing it.
I confess in the last years I've learned, among others, from your resources, for instance, the debunking handbook, a really great resource that you've written with, for instance, Gail Sinatra, who's also appeared on this podcast, that I did debunking supposedly wrong. In the past, I often started with repeating the myth. Could you please point to some myths about myth busting?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, that bad practice of repeating the myth and leading with the myth, that's how I started with skeptical science too, because I wasn't even aware that there was a field of science communication. I came from a physics background and I was just trying to communicate the facts from a communicate the facts and job done kind of perspective as someone with a physics degree. And then it was a cognitive scientist, Stefan, who emailed me some psychology research showing that if you do it wrong, then your debunkings might backfire and actually make matters worse. And that was a big shock to me because I was doing it that wrong way as that paper testing. But it turns out that in the that was around 2010, 2011 that Lewandowski would have emailed me. It was in the 15 years since then, the backfire effect it's a bit like the abominable snowman. It's really difficult to detect. And scientists have tried to replicate it in many, many experiments, and it very rarely comes up. So I would say one of the biggest myths in the field of debunking is the backfire effect. It's not the boogeyman that we once thought it was, even though it was the boogeyman that scared me into the field of psychology, only to find out that it wasn't actually as prevalent. That said, if we debunk in bad ways, then we can be ineffective. So we might not make matters worse, but we might not have the positive effect that we're hoping to get. I would put the backfire effect up there. And also this idea of misinformation minimizes, arguing that misinformation is not a problem, or that, and this is related to the backfire effect, or that we shouldn't respond to misinformation because we might make matters worse or not be effective. The bigger danger is that we leave misinformation unchallenged. And so, I think those are all the myths that sort of lead you to the conclusion that we shouldn't act against misinformation. Those are probably the most damaging ones.
And there we have this aversion,
controversy aversion, which I don't know if that's a term. I just made it up while we were talking, but
but it feeds into this. I find your approaches to dealing with myths in climate science quite refreshing. Instead of just using refutation texts, long or short, you also use infographic, cartoons, videos. There was like this critical thinking cafe, for instance. And I really love your ecosystem that you and your team have created. You could also call it maybe a cranky Uncle versum. Why do you use so many different formats? Would you recommend that?
I use different formats because there are lots of different places, contexts, audiences where different formats are appropriate. So whether it's a short image that you post on social media or a video that you post on YouTube or or a short article or just a short debunking that you could post on our platform, or a long one that you can post as an article or even a book chapter, which I've done. There's so many different contexts, so we need to be flexible and explore different ways of doing it. Also reaching different audiences. If we want to reach more people, we have to do different formats. Also, different formats have their strengths and weaknesses. Like humor, we've done a few experimental tests comparing humor versus non-humor, and find that humor has the benefits of grabbing people's attention longer, and it's effective, and it's more likely to be shared and therefore go viral. Whereas serious debunkings have higher credibility. And so, that's a strength as well. So these are two different approaches with different strengths. Similarly, fact-based versus logic-based. Fact-based is good if you're a domain expert, like a scientist or a sustainability expert. Logic-based is more general, and it has a lot of advantages, such as you're basically improving people's critical thinking. So logic-based corrections can work across topics. My very first experiment in it found that I was debunking misinformation about tobaccos and smoking, and found that it conveyed immunity or resistance against climate misinformation using the same technique. So again, different approaches have different strengths and benefits. So I think we need to be flexible and open to using different approaches.
That sounds very reasonable. I guess Sander van der Linden wrote in his book Foolproof that you need different strategies against the various different kinds of dark arts in misinformation, if you would like to call it like that. When writing refutations, for instance, for my own blogs, NoteLab, which is about note making or evidence-informed note making and evidence-informed sustainability, as well as talking to others, I struggle a lot with the fact-first approach, as it feels a little bit unnatural to me in discussions. Lately, I found an article by Swire Thompson and you and colleagues where you found in a series of experiments that the correction format has a limited role when debunking misinformation. Could you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I aspire to try to structure my debunkings according to the fact, myth, fallacy, fact structure. However, I'm not 100% dogmatic about that. So often, depending on the context, you might not have the flexibility to do that. And again, being flexible with different formats. So sometimes you do need to just go myth, fact. But ideally, I do try to put the emphasis on the fact if possible. So it's about trying to identify what is that key fact that dislodges the myth, and how can I communicate it in a really simple, sticky way. And then if you can lead with that, then it's just a strong foundation. But yes, if it is unnatural, if you find that it might be easier, depending on how you're structuring your information, to go it's fact, then sure. But do try to have your audience come away with the fact as the key thing that they remember.
I see.
I'll give you an example. I've got a photo. A friend in DC sent me a photo of a bus stop, and it had in really big writing, "Make money from prostitution" or something like that. And then in very tiny writing underneath, it just said, "No, that's bad," or I forget the debunking of it. But it was just all you saw was the myth, and all you remember was this really shocking, vivid myth. So you want people to come away with the fact as the key thing.
I would totally agree. I see a lot of, for instance, LinkedIn posts or on other social media or articles where you have where the myth is written in a very big font, and the myth is even symbolized in form of a graphic which displays, and then there is the refutation below, and it's all written in a small font, and it disappears kind of. Or if we are honest, we often read only the headlines sometimes, and I think that's useful to start with the fact first. I got this feedback from a talk I recently gave at the PKM Summit, Personal Knowledge Management Summit in Utrecht, that it was hard for the audience to follow the fact myth fallacy, fact structure, as it kind of is unnatural to their habits of receiving this kind of information.
Because fact checks usually emphasize the myth first.
Right.
Was that research or was that somebody?
It was just anecdotal evidence.
Right. Yeah.
And for me, it's also...
I think that with science communication, there is I wouldn't call it a myth, maybe an irony that often science communication researchers are not very good at communication, and you see this at science communication conferences a lot. And one consequence of that is when they design their science communication experiments, sometimes the text that they use isn't the best thing that could be done. The devil is in the details in terms of, it can be awkward to write fact, myth, fallacy stuff, but if you work at it, you can do it well. We worked with Facebook on writing debunkings of climate myths, and they were like, you got 2 paragraphs and it has to be really simple. And I said, can we do fact, myth, fallacy, fact? And they said yes, but you have to soften the way you explain the fallacy. And we managed to do it. And we did it in a very, I think, readable, accessible way, because making it accessible to the average citizen was important. And so it is possible to do it. Science communication is hard. You have to work at it.
Before we come to a close, I would love to do a quick round on statements, present you with a few from sustainability education, so to speak, and would love you to indicate whether you see them as kind of myths, facts, or something in between. And if you like a brief explanation of your reasoning, maybe a fallacy that you've spotted. Statement 1 would be only lecturers who themselves...
Just before we do that,
go ahead.
The big qualifier, like now we're getting outside my expertise land, so I will be responding to these statements as a non-expert in this field, but yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Statement 1, only lecturers who themselves think and act in a sustainable way should be allowed to train students.
All right, so I'll extrapolate to my field, because ad hominem attacks against climate scientists is a common one, saying that if they're not, climate scientists are hypocrites because they fly to conferences and et cetera. So I think that, and I even address this in the Cranky Uncle book, in terms of should we walk the walk or talk the talk? And the answer is both. But I think the answer to this question is they don't have to, but it makes your talk more powerful if you walk the walk. So we walk the walk so that when we talk the talk, it's more impactful. But I don't think it's an absolute prerequisite. I don't know if that answers your question sufficiently, but I guess the way I debunked it in the Cranky Uncle book was it was a false dichotomy to say that we should only do one or the other. Is that right? We can do both. I'm not sure. Now I'm just.
So would you rather say it's kind of myth or something in between?
I would say it's kind of a myth with a grain of truth. Yeah. So I don't know. That's a tough one because you are going to be more effective if you're talking about sustainability and you're not walking the walk. Then I think you'd speak with less credibility.
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your perspective on that one?
Well, from a practical perspective, as nobody's perfect, I'm not sure if there would be any lecturers left. So, right. But I see it similar, as you pointed to ad hominem arguments, etc. Statement 2. Being expected to integrate sustainability into teaching interferes with my academic freedom or the academic freedom of faculty. So if your university has kind of a vision where it says, our goal is to promote sustainability in all our courses and all our programs on all levels, this interferes with my academic freedom.
Yeah, I disagree with that one because, well, firstly, I strongly believe in academic freedom, and the cases where my academic freedom was interfered with by the university, I resisted it strongly. But those cases were because the interference with my freedom was conflicting with the values of the university and myself. And so I think that universities do and should have values, and therefore those values should be reflected in the university's research and education. So I think academic freedom is not absolute,
Yeah.
just like freedom of speech is not absolute. There are limits on it, and I think that being expected to reflect the values of the university is appropriate. And again, what's your thoughts on this one?
I would argue similarly. It comes back to the neutrality position of the university, but also the lecturers. I don't think they should, and I don't think that they can be neutral. I think maybe there is this slippery slope argument behind that. If you, for instance, say, a university wants to teach me sustainability, next month they will come and want me to teach about X, Y, Z. But every company has also like values that they orient themselves towards, or every other institution. So why not a university? And I
think that universities, well, they're in a position to be, and arguably should be, leaders in society. And this is another thing that I've faced is when we produced our MOOC, actually, there was pushback from climate deniers saying you shouldn't be doing a MOOC about climate misinformation.
Okay, interesting.
And so there was controversy, and there were some people at the university that were scared of that controversy. It was controversy aversion. And we made the argument that the university has a responsibility to be a leader in society. And so we should be willing to stick our neck out and make statements about misinformation and stand up for science. And fortunately, we prevailed and were able to produce the MOOC.
Statement 3, the inner development goals. So the IDGs are the new panacea when it comes to tackling the grand challenges that we face today.
What are the inner development goals?
It's a framework developed by a nonprofit organization which states that we need something like empathy, something like self-reflection, so that we need to get a good introspection, and that we need to develop ourselves before we can tackle the grand challenges. It's like the pendant to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN, which focuses more on criteria outside of inner selves.
Is it arguing that we need to do this inner development before we can pursue goals like the sustainability goals? Yeah. Well, that just sounds like a excuse for procrastination. I mean, certainly pursue these things, but we can walk and chew gum, right? So again, that sounds like a false dichotomy that we should do one before we do the other. I think we need to be sustainability development is too urgent to be put off while we try to get ourselves organized.
What I also find with this statement, that it puts a lot of pressure on the individual again, which happens, I think, also a lot when it comes to climate science, that you have to change your behavior, instead ignoring like the default lifestyles that are afforded or promoted by systemic or political structures that comes to mind.
Those type of individual arguments were championed by the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah,
they're the ones who developed the first carbon footprint calculators.
Right.
And the goal there was to shift the blame from the fossil fuel companies onto us, individual, and frame climate change as an individual solution rather than a systemic solution. And so, if that's the emphasis of the IDGs, then that's insidious. But interestingly, I was just at a conference where we were talking about individualism versus systemic solutions to misinformation, because my field is individual cognition. It's about building resilience and critical thinking in the individual, as opposed to systemic solutions to misinformation. So there's an irony that in the climate misinformation realm, I've been talking about individualism as a problem and systemic solutions being the real thing. But in my own field of misinformation, I've been doing almost the same thing. We need to be more holistic. We need to look at systemic solutions as well as individual, basically top down and bottom up.
Yeah, but I think it can be a starting point, right, for getting herd immunity, for instance. So these individual beliefs, they can also like form into collective beliefs over time.
I mean, that's one thing, but there's a whole suite of solutions and tools that we can use to counter misinformation. Like the systemic ones can involve regulation of social media platforms, broader education programs, just more legal and government approaches. So I think we need to be doing the individual solutions and building up herd immunity or public resilience at the same time that we're pursuing top-down solutions as well. But top-down solutions is not my area, though. Other people can pursue that. I'll be sticking to the individual cognition solutions.
No, I see. Another one would be statement 4. Even if I'm deeply concerned about sustainability, my individual actions as an educator don't matter. So I don't see the point of engaging in sustainability education. I can't save the world.
Yeah, so this is the similar argument here with climate change as well. So I guess the answer to both are the same, which is that yes, we need a collective solution, but every individual is part of a collective. So we have to all do our bit, and then it all adds up to an overall solution. And also with climate change, and I'm going to guess in the sustainability education context, the thing that I say to people is the most important thing you can do to help climate change is just open your mouth and start talking about it. Because in order to achieve a systemic change, you need social and political momentum, and you can't get that momentum unless we're all talking about it and sharing the fact that we are concerned about it. When we don't do that, then you get climate silence, and that can be self-reinforcing.
Spiral of silence.
And so just opening our mouth and talking about it is how individuals contribute, and then they contribute to a systemic solution.
I see. And maybe a last statement. When we look, for instance, at the planetary boundaries and see that we've crossed already several of those, it's too late to engage in sustainability education.
Yeah, this is another one with climate, like climate doomism is what we're calling it. It's kind of this belief that, we can't solve it. And this is a myth that commits the fallacy of, again, false dichotomy.
Okay.
It's looking at climate change or sustainability problems as a binary situation. We either solve it or we don't. It's either disaster or it's not. Climate change is a matter of degrees, and literally. And so therefore, every little bit of action we do reduces the amount of impact that we're going to be suffering in the future. So when you look at it as degrees rather than binary, that's really what gets me out of bed every morning is just keep trying, just keep working at it, and we'll just reduce it that little bit and keep building momentum.
Yeah. With that, we already come to the end of the interview. Could you recommend any persons, literature, resources that I should explore on this topic that you would find very helpful? You've now gotten a little insight into my research. What would be your expert opinion on that?
I would point you to the Debunking Handbook 2020, not the 2011 version, because we put too much emphasis on backfire effects back then, promoting a myth, unfortunately, in hindsight. But that's why we did the updated 2020 version, to really build a summary of debunking research based on the last 10, 20 years. And it's generalizable. So it's not just about climate change. It's about misinformation in any topic. So I think that anyone who has to deal with misinformation, it gives a lot of general principles that people would find useful.
Yeah. Is there anything else you would like to point to that you would like to emphasize?
Well, it's a bit self-serving, but I'd probably point people either to skepticalscience.com if they want to see an example of debunking in action, although we're still trying to bring our own content into alignment with the Debunking Handbook principles. And also crankyuncle.com is also about debunking misinformation, but it has much more of a logic-based emphasis, critical thinking-based, whereas skeptical science is much more fact-based and about climate science information.
Yeah, I think you've spent so much time creating these resources, and they're very valuable. That's why I think it's totally fine to lead people to those or refer people to those. Well, thanks a lot for the interview. It was super insightful for me.
My pleasure. It was really great to talk to you.
Thank you for your interest in the Sustainability Education Podcast. Did you find the insights helpful? Do you have any questions, comments, or objections? Then feel free to get in touch and share this episode with others. This podcast is produced by the Institute of Business Education and Educational Management at the University of St. Gallen. Thank you for listening and hear you in the next episode. Bye bye.